Welcome to Wellness with John, resources to help you thrive. I'm John Peters, a therapist who's been working with thousands of patients over 25 years. And this video is about working with the first year of grief and beyond. Stay tuned. Okay, so in this video, I want to talk about grief and thinking about it during the first calendar year after a major change or loss. Not that grief is a process that takes only a year. The bad news is grief goes on for a long time, but there are some reasons to think about how to navigate the first calendar year after a major change or loss. And I say this based on working with many, many people over the last 2.5 decades who have been going through a grief process after a loss or going through a major change like divorce, and who have raised questions about how to cope with holidays, how to cope with birthdays, how to cope with annual family rituals and things like that. And so I want to share some things that I've learned in talking with these people about just the contours, the lay of the land when it comes to experiencing grief as it relates to encountering these times of the year, especially during the first calendar year, but also how that evolves beyond the first year, okay? So first, let me start and talk about how annual cycles exist in our psychology. So we relate to annual cycles because it imbues events with meaning. And this is why there are annual holiday seasons. This is why there are annual family rituals. This is why, if you're religious, there's an annual cycle of religious events and religious rituals and religious holidays, and why there's a liturgical calendar, right? The literal theology of a religion is laid out in an annual cycle. But even if you're not religious, we all exist in time. And even if you're someone like me, who honestly, I don't care that much about time, dates, ages, holidays, and things like that. I'm a little bit of a bah humbug Scrooge at Christmas time. But the thing is, we exist this way because time is one of the ways that we make meaning of our experience. It's one of the ways that we make meaning of our connections to others. So if you look at how holidays function, a primary function of holidays is to affirm relationships, close relationships, family relationships, community relationships, even all the way out to the macro level of national holidays like July 4th, that's a very broadly celebrated thing. So because holidays exist that way, one thing to be aware of is that after a major change or loss, holidays are really loaded. They're loaded with grief in some special ways, because when we view a holiday, we don't just view this holiday, even though we may be focused on what's going to happen on this next celebration on such and such a date. But we do think about holidays through all of those cycles of time, extending back in time, and even into that yet to be defined future of those annual cycles that we expect to exist into the future throughout the rest of our lives. So when we talk about like Christmas, we're not really just talking about this Christmas. We're talking about all the Christmases extending backward and forward in time. And so holiday celebrations are loaded with grief because the loss or the change is a direct affront. It's a direct injury to a core feature of how we have been experiencing those holidays and how we expected to continue to experience the holidays. So it's a very radical kind of crisis to face the first of a particular type of holiday in the first annual cycle after a major change or loss, right? That's part of why those first times are going to be especially loaded. And I think that they're also loaded because we have to be kind of creative in order to figure out how we're going to navigate them, how we're going to surf them. And we may not feel on top of our game because our psychological resources are depleted because of the challenge of the overall grief process. And so that's kind of an extra handicap in terms of being able to deal with the complexity and the challenge of being creative in dealing with how we're going to craft dealing with this upcoming holiday during that first annual cycle after a major change or loss. So it is especially challenging, and it's not surprising that people bring this up in therapy a lot when they're dealing with grief issues is, man, what am I going to do? There's this birthday coming up, or now we're nearing the end of the year and the holiday season is coming up, and how are we going to deal with that? So I have a couple of tips that potentially could help you based on what I have experienced and learned from the people that I've worked with through this particular type of situation. And one tip that I will throw out to consider is the holiday doesn't need to be as it is going to be in the years beyond. And therefore, you should unburden yourself and let yourself off the hook for having to craft this holiday, which is the first one you're experiencing after the major change or loss, in a way that's going to work in the future. And what I mean by that is let this one be this one and worry about the next one later. So, for example, this comes up a lot when I work with divorcing families and they get to the point in the year where like birthday celebrations are coming up or the season is coming up, and they've always done it a certain way, and now they're divorced or divorcing, and they're like, oh my God, now it's all complicated. We're not sure how to do Thanksgiving. Do we do all one together? Or do we do two separate Thanksgivings? And part of what people often feel stressed about is not only do we have to figure out this Thanksgiving that, let's say, is coming up in just a few weeks, but we want to situate that one and work it out so we do that one in a way that's also going to work out into the future. And why do they do this? Because that's the way we think about holidays. We don't think about holidays as just this ad hoc, isolated event that happens to be situated on a certain date. We think about holidays again as this one, but this one that relates meaningfully to all the ones before it. It also relates meaningfully in structure and purpose and how we experience it to all the ones that are going to come beyond it. So people often feel on the hook to have to figure out not only this Thanksgiving, but we got to do this one in a way that we think is going to work into the future, which you may not know. You may not know how next year is going to be. In fact, if you're going through the first year of grief after a major change or loss, I will throw out there, you don't know how next year is going to look because it is such a major set of radical changes that we experience and adjust to, that I strongly recommend that you let yourself off the hook and just know that you're going to get through this set of annual rituals and holidays and celebrations and family events, but don't worry about having to do them this year in a way that you are going to be assured are going to work into the future, right? And that gives more flexibility and freedom and creativity to do what is good for you, do what is good for how you need to take care of yourself, and maybe others need to take care of themselves as you move forward, right? So, for example, I talked with someone not long ago who had lost someone, and it was just a short time before a holiday celebration, and the family always did it a certain way, is expected to always generally do it about that certain way. And this patient of mine is a prominent figure in the family structure in terms of that celebration. And so they were worried that like maybe I can't show up in the way that I always have and the way that I generally want to because I'm in this grief process. And so I feel like a failure, or I feel like we can't do it the way we want to do it because I have to like sit out this one or just be low key or, show up briefly and then maybe leave. And so they were feeling extra stressed because they thought I have to perform a certain way in general, and I always have in this ritual, in this family ritual, but I don't feel up to it. And to me, that's an isolated, I don't feel up to it this time. And we just don't have to go out into the future. We don't have to work out, are you going to be up to it next year, right? Let's worry about next year, next year. Just worry about this year, this year. And if this Thanksgiving or this Christmas or this birthday celebration or this whatever, you don't feel up to it, do it how it works for you. And you can worry about working out a different way of relating to the holiday, maybe more like you did in the past, in the future, but whatever, you'll get to that next year. So what I suggest is that we reframe our normal relationship with annual cycles during the first year of grief, especially, so that we weaken a little bit our hold on our mental hold on framing things as these cycles that extend way back and way forward in time. And let's just do this one however we need to do this one, and we'll worry about the next ones later, right? So give yourself that freedom, and it's one way to lower stress. There's so many parts of the stress of grief that we would like to have direct control over, and we just don't. But there are some things that you can do differently that can give you a handle on your stress and can significantly impact how you can cope. And this is one of them. And so the short of it is, give yourself the freedom to just do this one as it's going to work for you without the burden to have to do this one as it's going to work out into the future, because you can worry about the next cycle next year, right? Another thing that I have noticed when I have been talking with people about encountering holidays and these annual kind of dates in the first year after a major change or loss, is that things are not always as you expect. And so part of what I think is helpful in competently working with your grief as it regards, like these birthday and holiday celebrations and things like that, is just know that what you expect may be the case when you actually get to the actual celebration, the actual date, or talk to someone about the date. But it's usually a mixed bag. And it's usually in large part, and sometimes very much so, different from what you expect. And what I mean by this is that, like I talked with someone recently who's going through a grief process. And part of what we did was we scheduled a therapy session on a particular day because the patient expected to have some significant challenges related to their grief. Okay, so it was a birthday celebration day that had always occurred for decades in a certain way. They had lost their person, and this birthday of the person was coming up, and reasonably they were expecting that day to be extra challenging, right? So we scheduled this therapy appointment on that day. And so when I talked with the person, which was about, 2/3 of the way through the day, what they told me was something that a lot of people have told me in this situation is, you know what? Today wasn't half as hard as I expected it to be, right? Now, does that mean that they were misguided when they were anticipating how challenging it was going to be? No, because you don't know. It's a bit of a wild card. It's a mixed bag, and you have to kind of wait till you get to certain moments to know how that moment is actually going to be, even if you're making a fairly good prediction of what you think it's going to be like. But I think part of the explanation for this particular patient in the case that I'm referring to is they were engaging with acceptance and openness and with meaningful involvement with self-reflection and the therapy and, good social support. They were engaging meaningfully in the grief process. And because of all that, and the constructive working through the grief, and also, having open awareness and acceptance and anticipating this upcoming birthday date, I think what happened was that they went ahead and kind of processed some of that stuff that was coming up related to the date before they got to the actual date. So I think that was part of the explanation in that case. And that's part of what we do. Our big brains have the ability to kind of grieve ahead of time. And I'm going to make a whole video about that, about what happens when you actually grieve earlier than you think you should, which happens, for example, like when you lose someone to a long process like dementia. But anyway, we'll come back to that later. But anyway, so the actual dates are not always what you expect. Sometimes they are harder in ways that you didn't anticipate, and sometimes they are not as challenging, even though you reasonably expected them to be challenging, right? So part of the so what about that is you have to just kind of say, I'm going to encounter what I'm going to encounter there. I'm going to set myself up for success by giving myself the freedom to do it as I can, and accept that I may not be able to do certain aspects of it. And I'm going to put in place some good social support. Now, you don't always have to schedule a therapy appointment on these days, but I do think that one aspect of coping with holidays and birthdays and annual events like this is not necessarily being totally isolated and alone and unsupported. Now, it's okay if you have one of these days and what's best for you is going to be being a hermit and spending it alone. If that's the most constructive thing for you, then that's it. But if that's your only choice, for some people, then that feels too thin in terms of support. So one way to deal with holidays, I think, is to find allies, whether they're your therapist or your pastoral counselor in your congregation or a family member or a friend or a pet, and spend that day having the option, whether you have a specific plan or not, but set up the option to have some social support in order to get through it, right? And pets do matter, by the way. I talked to someone recently who told me, he said, the only reason I think I've survived this grief process intact is because of my cat. Because my cat is there and provides comfort. My cat will sit and listen to me while I ramble and talk and rant and talk through my grief process. So pets can be very, very supportive through the grief process. But also, of course, people and therapists and pastoral counselors and whatnot. But anyway, so do holidays this way this year, let next year be next year, and give yourself the freedom to do it as it works for you, and know that that may not be exactly how you're supposed to perform, but you can only do what you can do, right? And then also realize that it's an unknown mixed bag to some degree, and sometimes there's some new challenges that pop up that you don't totally expect. But it's often the case that if you are someone who is being very consciously, openly, meaningfully involved in your grief process, you're likely to be surprised that they aren't quite as challenging in ways that you fear a lot of the time. I think that that's more the case, that they're super challenging for people when they're on the earlier side of dealing with the grief process, or for people who are having difficulty kind of getting into a groove of working with their grief. And so they're feeling more battered around and blindsided by certain moments and certain days. And that smooths itself out over time, not as quickly as you want, but it does progressively get better over time, especially with good support and with a willingness to be openly engaged in your grief process. So the first year, I would say, if we wanted to boil it down to one kind of phrase, it's a year of shock, because you have the shock of the loss, but then that shock reoccurs, especially on holidays and dates that were about affirming your relationship with the person that you've lost, or with the situation that has changed, like in the situation of divorce. And so you have to ride out those instances of that shocking experience as they get triggered for many reasons, but one reason is through these annual cycles and these dates that are imbued with special meaning. The years beyond the first year are often not characterized as years of shock in my mind when I think about how people experience the grief cycle through annual cycles. But subsequent years are often that more long-term grief process where people are working out the renegotiation of their relationship with the person that they lost or the situation that they lost, and crafting a new life that grows beyond the loss. And often when grief is prominent in the subsequent years, it's less a year of shock, and it's often more about what we call secondary losses. So secondary losses have to do with the things that we derived from our relationship with the person who died, or the things we derived from the situation that is now significantly changed, like in divorce. And so secondary losses can include, for example, let's say I'm a parent, so I derive deep meaning in my parental role. If I lose my child, that's a secondary loss. I've lost my experience of being the parent in the relationship, right? And so often the subsequent years beyond the first year have as prominent these themes that have to do with coping with adjustments related to those secondary losses and dealing with finding ways to live a life where we have those needs met, but not the way that they were before, basically. So first year tends to be a year of shock. It includes confronting the adjustments to the secondary losses, but the subsequent years tend to be the working out of how do we deal with the fact that we're adjusting to that wide range of secondary losses that come after a major loss or change in our life. So I hope that this content is helpful for you. If you're going through a grief process, I have a lot of empathy for you because, as I mentioned, I've worked with so many people over the last 2.5 decades with their grief processes. If you're really struggling and you feel like you're having frank anxiety and frank depression, get some help, right? Get a competent therapist, get some social support. If you're in a crisis, you can call the suicide hotline 24/7 and you'll have somebody to talk to from one minute to the next. They can often make competent referrals in your community. Talk to a pastoral counselor, get some good support, get some good help, and realize that grief is a very complex process, and you're going to have to do it your way, and your way may not conform with how you think you're supposed to, right? One really good book that I'll throw out there that's worth checking out is Resilient Grieving by Lucy Hone, and I'll put a link in the description of this video below if you want to check that out. But Resilient Grieving has a lot of good tips of talk where she talks about working through grief and using her own self as an example, because the author lost her daughter, and that's part of why she became more competent at dealing with grief, because she had to struggle with such a challenging grief process herself. So you might find that book really helpful as well. So feel free to like this video if you like this kind of content, and feel free to subscribe if you like my channel, and I will see you in an upcoming video.